Okay. So I am curious about who has seen this before and who hasn't. So if you were in, was anybody in Animation Fundamentals last semester? Was you all? So you all definitely saw it. I remember giving that lecture. But it's cool because then you animated for like 3 weeks, and probably like a refresher on some of this would be pretty cool, or it'd be pretty good for you. Some of you may have seen it in Animation Fundamentals as well. It is a big PowerPoint presentation, 99%. Here we go. And if why does it always do that? Okay. All right. How many of you have seen this one before? Like this slide seems familiar. Okay. If you haven't, that's okay. This is actually a presentation I'm pretty happy with. I think it has a lot of good information, but it has a lot of information that is very directly relevant to what we're going to be doing with those figure drawing sketches. So let's go ahead and start. Pose to pose, crafting strong animation poses. This was originally a presentation I put together for East Coast Game Conference. I will say we're going to the East Coast Game Conference, ECGC. We're going to that again this year. It's April 19th. I think I mentioned that to you before, or maybe it's 16th. And if you're interested, we are setting up the information meeting for that now. I just met with Katie and Jesse. It will be at next Friday, I think at 4 is what we settled on. But they'll hang up some flyers about it. If you're interested in going to that, I'm hopefully going to be giving some more talks then too. So, so some of this is still left over from that. Just kind of ignore that. So we're going to start off with the 12 principles. You all have probably already tattooed all of these on your body in some way or another, right? Forearm, on your back? No? Okay, so I want to primarily focus on 2 of these. For this lecture, when we talk about pose, we're talking about principle number 4, straight ahead action and pose to pose, and talking about staging, because your character's pose in the staging carries a lot of the weight of making something communicate clearly or not. So let's talk about those 2 really quick. Straight ahead animation. This just means you're creating the frames in consecutive order, right? So I can stop motion. You create frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, and that's how you make the action happen, right? One frame after the other. Very few of you have probably ever animated purely straight ahead. Like, you have?
I am too.
So stop motion is usually the place we see this the most. We'll do some variations of straight ahead animation in Maya when we're trying to like solve a problem, right? Like I don't necessarily know how a character is going to stumble, so maybe I'll just start setting keyframes or key poses as my character is moving to try to figure out that motion as they move, right? Most of the time what we use in 3D animation is pose-to-pose animation. We have these key landmarks or these key poses that our character hits, and we put those in place as a pose, right? We craft the whole character pose, and then traditionally an in-betweener an assistant would do all the in-betweens, right? They would do those in-between drawings. Maya is our in-betweener, and we know that Maya doesn't do the best job at that, so we have to kind of hold its hand a little bit. So the point of this lecture is that strong key poses, will result in better in-betweens in between those key poses, right? If you make some really strong poses, Maya is going to suck at creating in-betweens a little less, right? It's not going to be good at it, but it'll at least get you a little closer, and then you can go back in and fix those in-betweens a little easier. If you have one crappy key pose and another crappy key pose, like, Maya's not going to make the in-betweens better, right? Maya's not going to make strong poses from your crappy key poses. So, I like looking, this is a long, literally 285 slides. I'll start going faster here in a second. But this is a clip from Milk Call's animation. You can see his key poses when we start seeing these little timing charts on the side of the drawing there. You'll see where it says dialogue 21 to 23. That's him making notes on the drawing to tell the in-betweener, this is how I need you to do your in-betweens, right? And so I just love this because every pose is so good. Like, every one of them is something that I would love to frame and hang on my wall. And in fact, I'm confident that each of these images probably sell for about $1,500 each now, because I'm a little bit of an animation drawing and sell junkie. eBay and Etsy. Like, there's a lot of, actually, if you're interested in TV sales and drawing, you can get those relatively cheap, like from a TV show. What happens is people will buy like a whole lot of them. I actually have a lot of one set as well. But you can buy like individual frames from like The Simpsons for probably like $15. But if you're looking for the old classic Disney stuff, the old classic Looney Tunes stuff, that gets really high, especially if you can confirm that it was made by a famous animator. Like, my goal is to someday own a Glenn Keane drawing. So you can see, Milk Call would be awesome, but I can't even imagine that. I do actually own a Frank and an Ollie. Like, I have a Frank Thomas and an Ollie Johnston, but they're like pre-production drawings. So, but these are just awesome. Actually, these are like every pose in here. Like, you can just see so much information in it. And so when we're talking about strong poses, we have to realize, like, that's in every drawing. Even though you're doing strong key poses, every pose of your animation has to be strong. Now, that again that was straight ahead action, pose to pose. I'm sorry, yeah, straight ahead and pose to pose. Let's talk about staging for a second. Staging is presenting it as clearly as possible. Whatever the information is, you're presenting it as clearly as possible. We hear staging in terms of theater, right? And that's still the same thing. Like, you know, Romeo's going to deliver his soliloquy. Is that what it is he delivers? You need to make sure he's like out there in the open where people can see it. And Juliet's up on the balcony, or people are going to have no idea what he is talking about. So staging is all about making sure whatever the point of that shot is, you are presenting it to the audience in the clearest way possible so they can understand it. That includes everything from the way forms are like divided up, or foreground, middle ground, background elements, and how those shapes are divided up to take up screen space. It includes stuff like rule of thirds, right? How you actually do your composition of your scene. It includes stuff like using negative space and like size comparison, right? So all of these things are part of staging, but one of the elements of staging that we have the most amount of control of, we have control of a lot of that too because we can control the camera, but one of the elements we have the most control of is the pose, right? I use a lot of comic book reference. I read a lot of comics on my iPad, and I'll just be flipping through, and like it'll almost like take your breath away. I don't know if any of you are comic fans. When you flip a page, it's like just an awesome pose, and you're like, that's awesome. And like then I'm reading on the iPad, so I take a picture of it to save it. And so I have like all these pictures of these awesome poses that I save. But the pose tells us something about the character's relationship to the scene and the camera, right? Like, there's just, we understand when we see this that Wolverine is not exiting this gas station after buying some Little Debbie's and a cup of coffee, right? Well, like we know all about like who he is in relationship to this scene, and the pose can tell us something about it. He's diving while he's on fire, and somebody is on the other end of this dive that is not going to enjoy it, right? So I'll go out on a limb here and say a statement that may not seem that huge, but it's a huge statement. Pose, in my opinion, is the single most important thing in animation. Like it is our alphabet for communication, right? It is the only thing that we have as an animator to communicate with. A close second, but not ahead to me, is timing. Because timing, if it's really bad, can mess it up. But you can sell the entire point of a shot with a single pose that never moves. Comic books tell us that, right? I understand so much about this just from this single pose. So how do I make my poses less boring? That's usually the problem. When you get a character, the poses that you make just have to be appealing. Every one of them have to be strong, and if you do make those strong, then the poses in between will also be strong. So usually the problem is that the poses are boring. And the three ways you make those less boring is contrapposto, line of action, and silhouette. Now, you will hear me say these lines or these words a lot. These three things all are interrelated or interconnected, but they build up to a single pose that is that communicates well. So really, again, what we're doing is we're trying to learn how to communicate as animators. These are our three things that we can use to do that. So let's start off with a boring pose. This is Franklin. He is a free rig you can download from Artella. I don't know if he's on the link or not, but if you're interested, I can get you a link to him. And so really all I did is I opened up this rig and I put his arms down so he wasn't in the T-pose anymore. This pose is boring. And there's a lot of reasons that this is boring, but this is what we're combating as student animators. Like you will see student reels all the time where the character is walking like this, and it just looks so like you move two controls and then you try to move your character. So really most of the time what we're trying to do from when we're trying to make a character more interesting is we're trying to take them away from this sort of boring bind pose that Maya gives you. So let's talk about physics a little bit. Currently, gravity is pulling downward on Franklin. I mean, in theory, right? So if gravity is pulling downward on him, why doesn't he fall? Well, he doesn't fall because he is pushing backwards on the ground, right? If that's where his feet are touching the ground, his legs are pushing in the opposite direction of gravity, holding him up, right? And that means that everything that falls above that base of support, where his feet are contacting the ground, everything that falls above that is being supported. This is a big part of weight. This is how we can communicate a character's weight. So let's say Franklin raises 1 foot off the ground, right? Now his base of support has changed. That is no longer his base of support. Now that is his base of support. And you'll see that the area that lies outside of that base of support is a lot of mass. Gravity is still pulling down on that, so Franklin falls over, right? The way we fix this is we shift Franklin over top of that new base of support. And as long as he is sort of evenly balanced on that, then we can keep our character in balance, right? We can keep our weight seeming correct. A lot of times why weight feels off is because as our character is moving, they're not shifting their weight, and it just feels like they're not adhering to the law of gravity. So it takes a newborn human about 3 years to learn how to do this with their own body. That's the hardest part of walking, right? Is that you have to shift your weight as you walk. And that's kind of it's like learning to use a yo-yo, right? There's like almost a rhythm to it. It takes a fully grown animation student about 3 years to learn how to do this. So I have to really hammer this into you. Like, you can never lift your character's feet off the ground. You can never lift your character's left foot off the ground until they have shifted their weight over their right foot. Even if it's for an instant, right? Even these tiny little feet shuffles, your body has this little bit of shift of your weight. So this is actually the root of contrapposto. When we talk about contrapposto as one of those three elements we're going to build into our pose, this is just the Italian word for like countering pose or counter pose. Our history teachers love this word. That's probably where you learned it. They were looking at some art piece and they were talking about contrapposto, but really it just means your shoulder and your hip angle have a countering relationship, right? So this is Franklin, and we look at his shoulders and his hips, and they're parallel, right? And parallel is boring. So if we give it some angle, yay, contrapposto, right? If we look at this is kind of the poster child for contrapposto, Michelangelo's David. In fact, if you look up contrapposto on Wikipedia, this is the image it will show you. And so you can see that he has this countering hips and shoulders. Now the physics behind this makes sense. He shifted his weight over what would be his right leg. No, wait. Yes, his right leg. I'm really bad at my left and right, y'all. So he's shifted his weight over his right leg, and that means that the force of gravity is pulling him down, and that leg is driving his hip upward, right? He's also reaching with his left leg, and so that's causing his hips to be at an angle. Now, if David's spine were fused, it would just be at that angle now. He would be leaning. But that's not how spines work. Spines are made up of little bitty tiny pieces that bend into a curve. And so the resulting counter angle of his shoulders is the opposite of his hips. And so when we talk about contrapposto, what we're seeing is these countering angles between the shoulders and the hips. So if we add this to Franklin's boring pose, right? He's raising this leg up off the ground, so I raise that hip a little bit. His shoulders are still parallel to that line, but his spine would bend to keep him in balance, and that's how we get this contrapposto, right? So even though this isn't completely there, this is a little less boring now, right? So contrapposto happens a lot in motion because our hips and our lower half of our body is moving and our spine is contorting to keep us in balance. So you'll actually see like this contrapposto changing over time in a walk cycle, right? Contrapposto isn't just about the angle though, it's also about the twist of your spine. So you see in this punch where the boxer's left leg is back, or right leg is back, their right arm is forward, right? And that's allowing their upper body to twist in this contrapposto. So contrapposto tells us a lot about our character's personality as well. Like very straight and rigid doesn't seem to have very much personality. And so this is the model sheet for Gaston. That doesn't feel like Gaston. Like that feels like Gaston. That cocky angle to everything is a big part of what gives him his personality. And you'll see that this is built into it, that contrapposto is built into this from early points in the animation process. Mr. Incredible, we see that contrapposto in his shoulders a little bit, he's leaning, but check this out. The contrapposto is also in his face. So these countering angles are important for a lot of reasons. One, that brings some personality to his face, but two, it also opens up this side of his face to the person he's talking to. And if you remember in this scene, this is him trying to be this is him basically trying to give this woman some opportunities even though his job doesn't want him to, right? So he's trying to open up to her, and that contrapposto in the face sends us a little subtle cue about that, right? Okay, the next element that makes your pose less boring, line of action. Now, line of action is not arcs, and a lot of people get those confused. Line of action is this imaginary line that you could draw through your entire character's pose that tells us something about the energy and the flow of energy through that form, through that shape. So whenever you get your character in a pose, you can just try that. Try drawing a line through the character and see if you're getting a sweeping line or if you're getting a kind of hinky, like crinkled line, right? And so a lot of times this line of action is clear because that's how physics works. This is more efficient to have a clean line of action when you're doing some action, right? Versus a poor line of action, like that would just be an awkward hit. You're not going to get very much energy out of it, right? So the good line of action just works. You'll also notice that in that line of action, we're getting a contrast in the curve angle, right? It's like concave, convex in the one that's marked right. So Franklin's line of action isn't terrible, I guess, but how we find that is we kind of look at the curve of the spine and extend that curve of the spine line out. You'll see that it's not really super clean. It's got a little bit of a kink in it, right? So if we just push Franklin a little bit more like this, then our line of action is a little cleaner. It's a little nicer. So again, this adds a lot to our personality. This feels a little stiff and formal because this contrapposto is very straight, and that leads to a straight line of action. If you get some more angle in that contrapposto, then you get a little bit more of a line of action that feels more, it feels like it has a little bit more personality to it. Sometimes this is just an element of where you've placed the camera, right? I remember when I saved this file down, I named this one Boring Nerd. Versus, and that's because we got these very parallel lines. Like there's so many parallels in this, and that's just kind of boring to look at. However, this seems a little more interesting, right? We got this contrapposto, we got this swooping line. He is an upward, mobile, young business person. Our line of action often tells us something about the direction of the motion as well. This kid is probably not just floating in space like that, right? We can just look at his line of action and tell that more than likely he's traveling in that direction. Our line of action is there through every pose, and it is part of where we get our energy, where we get the motion. So you can see from this baseball pitch, this is an old animation, we can see from this baseball pitch the line of action and the way that progresses. Our line of action also appears in other parts of the body, not just through the spine. It's any section where we can trace a relatively smooth line. So between those two keys, this action, you can see there's our line of action and there's our line of action. But we also have this line of action that goes through the arms, right? It travels through the contrapposto line of the shoulders and out each of the arms. And so we get this and this line of action to help make this pose more appealing. So this is Harold Hadrada. This is a character I animated for Civ 5. This is when he introduces himself to you in the game. And so you can tell from his line of action that he's a very proud, very confident character, right? And if we look at that line of action, it feels like his chest is almost pulling him forward, right? So a line of action can dictate a lot about our character's personality and mood as well. Because later when you defeat Harold in battle, if you defeat Harold in battle, you get a different line of action, right? It feels like his head's pulling him down. So when we look at David's line of action, it feels not particularly smooth, right? And that was troubling to me for a while, and I'm like, why is that? Like, this is Michelangelo. He probably knew what he was doing, right? The answer to that is one of the reasons David is impressive as a sculpture is it's an enormous piece of rock, right? And this enormous piece of rock feels very fleshy. It feels very like you feel when you come home from a long day of class, right? You're tired and you're sagging while you're carrying your book bag. And so that's what's happening. David isn't standing there like ready to fight. He's in a casual pose, and we're able to see that weight sort of settling on his supporting leg, his right leg. And so if you tried to stand up something that is collapsing under its own weight, like a damp piece of spaghetti or something, it's going to try to crinkle down on top of itself, right? I wish I could come up with a better example. I don't know how many of you are like trying to stand up pieces of spaghetti, but you can imagine it. So David's line of action is there for a reason, and sometimes that is what you're wanting to go for, is this crinkled line of action, right? A lot of times you see, particularly in shapes that are trying to go for a more sleek design element, you'll see a little bit of an S line of action. So we can start looking for line of actions everywhere here, though, right? We got this line of action, this line of action. We have it in the feet and the legs here. We have it in the arms, right? And so, like, this is built, our characters are built up of all of these very cleanly swooping lines. These people didn't practice getting into that pose for this picture. Like, this is just what happens with physics, is efficiency leads to smoother lines. So, what we're actually looking at here, though, this is about the level of drawing I'm going to be asking you to do here in a bit. So don't sweat it too much. So our next piece of this puzzle is silhouette. This is the interactive portion of the show. So I'm going to pop up a silhouette. I know a lot of you have seen this presentation before, but that's all right. You can still try to beat people to the punch. I'm going to show you a silhouette. You're going to shout out who it is or what it's from. Ready? Here we go. Mickey. Mickey is designed that way to be able to be spotted in a fraction of a second, right? It's a very clear silhouette. And those ears are such a clear silhouette that they stand by themselves. Like, you can put those ears on like a t-shirt, people will buy that t-shirt, right? Just the ears. So the silhouette is part of the design. People will need to be able to recognize this character quickly. We were in Pigeon Forge a couple weeks ago with my mother-in-law, and we were actually going to Dollywood, and she's like, I just want to grab a bite before we go into Dollywood because it's super expensive there. Let me know if you see like a McDonald's or a restaurant somewhere. And it was like 3 miles away. I was like, I could see a McDonald's. Like, because that arc is designed to be able to pick it out from a distance. That's the same thing with silhouette. We are pattern spotting machines, right? And clear silhouettes allow us to spot those patterns. Keeps us from getting eaten in the jungle, right? If you spot a shape that looks like a giant cat, your body immediately says run, and they can pick that out in a fraction of a second, right? So silhouettes are like that. Let's try another silhouette. Here you go. Ready? Oh, I'm just lofting them to you now. These are too easy. Okay, ready for another one? Mario. That's him. What about this one? All right, yeah. Strangely to me, I don't actually think this is a great pose because that arm is sort of hidden in the silhouette a little bit, but she's still extremely distinctive just from certain design elements. Like, you can kind of pick her out just from the braid. Like, braid and combat boots, you're like Laura Croft. Probably a gun, too. That probably helps. What about this one? Pikachu. Okay, I've never even played this one, and I can spot this one from a distance. Tracer, yeah, it's from over. Most of you, even if you haven't played, you're like, it's from that Overwatch game. I think I see it everywhere. I probably should pull out something from Fortnite now. Like, I'm confident. Like, I feel like that one's coming on. So this one's a really old one, but a lot of you will still be able to pick it out. Yeah, this is part of this design, right? You need to be able to pick out these characters from a distance, so you shoot the right one and you run to the right one for help, right? So the character design, the character silhouette is a big part of the development of these characters, so you can spot them quickly, because they may run by an alley in like a 16th of a second, right? And you can spot who that is based off of their silhouette. But these guys, Beatles. Anybody know the album? Abbey Road. Turns out Paul's dead. There we go. But this one. Ooh, that's a good guess, though. Yeah, it is actually Nixon. I wish it was Freddie Mercury now. Now I'm disappointed I chose Nixon over Freddie Mercury. Here's one. This one's from a movie.
Oh, that's it's Willem Dafoe.
Castaway? No.
From
Somebody screaming no, or is he screaming yes?
I can't remember.
Now, do you remember?
Shawshank Redemption.
You guys got to go watch Shawshank Redemption. Like, did I stumble upon a class that's never watched Shawshank Redemption? Oh, it's good.
That Vietnam movie where Willem Dafoe was like.
Oh, I get you. Yeah, that's very close. Do I? Shawshank? Yeah. You realize that's a Stephen King book? Like that's like almost everything. It was a novella.
What's the one about the four boys that go find it?
Stand by Me. But it was the body in the book. So actually, everything in that collection of novellas has been made into a movie, except for the breathing method, and the breathing method is coming out in like 2020. So it's a weird one though. I don't think it's going to be like a Shawshank Redemption. Okay, so when we look at our character silhouette here, we're back to Franklin. Like, what is Franklin doing?
On Facebook.
Is he looking at Facebook on his phone? Is he shaving his chest hair? Is he eating a sandwich? Like, what is he doing, right?
Having like his hands together, being a street.
Yeah, so we just know that he's doing something in here, but it's not very clear what it is because it's not clear in the silhouette, right? And if we do something like this, we can see, well, he's at least contemplating something, right? It's easier to tell just by turning him a little bit and breaking those arms out of the silhouette. So even if we don't know what it is, we can tell that we can read that a lot clearer and more quickly, right? And the answer is it's a Rubik's Cube. He's almost there too. He's got like one more turn to go, but he's going to mess it up, and then he's just going to put it in the basement and never touch it again. And so if you're looking at the actual image, you could probably figure that out from here as well. It just doesn't read as quickly, right? So silhouette is important about helping us identify patterns quickly so we can recognize them and get that part of it out of the way, right? Have you ever watched a movie where a character comes onto screen and you know you saw them earlier, but you don't remember who they were? And like you spend half of that scene trying to remember who they were, so you miss what that scene was about, right? That's what we're trying to prevent from happening. It's like, if you can recognize Pikachu, now we're all like, oh, this shot's about Pikachu, right? And we can move on. A lot of the things that help us identify that is the negative space around the character, right? This shape around the character. And we start seeing these patterns in that negative shape. This straight line versus the contrasting like curvy line on the other side. This very like static lightning shape. And these patterns allow us to identify it quickly because nothing else falls into that category in our brain, right? So when we see this shape, what is it? It's a ballerina, right? Because our brain sees that shape and they see that negative space and it accesses that part of your brain that says ballerina. Like, it's not like, this is not confusable with ninja or I don't know, I'm running out of words, so I'm going to stop talking. Okay, so ballerina. What about this one? Baseball player, right? It's even the pitcher, right? You can even tell the point of the pitch. Now, this is interesting because this is at a very, this is a fraction of a second here, right? We're capturing this out of a fraction of a second. This as well, at a fraction of a second, but we can read that. Our eyes pick that up and recognize immediately, mostly based off of the negative space, right? There are little key elements to this, like the smooth head or the shape of the bat that lets us know this is baseball, not cricket, right? And so we're really good at spotting these. And these moments are extremely quick and extremely important. Like what happens in this instant decides the game, right? Like this is either going to go through the uprights or it's not. This instant, like the fight may be over or no, well, the fight's over. Like that's a pretty hard. I don't know So I want to point out that the reason we're working on these silhouettes is because these moments happen really quickly. So this is an animation I did for Battleborn. And it's a double impact, or a double swipe, or a double attack, right? So let's look at this frame by frame of these impacts. So we got frame 28, 29, 30, and then the impact, 31, right? And so we read that impact in the animation, but on frame 32, it's over. So this is 30 frames a second. 1/30th of a second is the only length of time we get to read that impact, right? The same with the second impact. We get 44, 45, 46. It's over. That impact happens in a single frame, and then it's over. So if that frame is not clear, we miss it. It's not communicated to the audience. So these moments are very important and very fleeting. Right? These kids are not going to hold this pose while you get your shutter speed set. And that's why this image is impressive and fun to look at, is because you realize you captured a very interesting moment in time very clearly. Right? Okay, so silhouette is something you improve in your posing process, like breaking the character's arms out of the silhouette, stuff like that. But I have a handful of pet peeves that I'm going to bring up. And you'll hear me mention these again, right? Most of them are about getting your character away from the bind pose. So stuff like boat paddle hands. This is how the hands were rigged, and you need to get them away from that so it doesn't feel so stiff. So just fix it, like loosen those up a little bit. The feet being parallel. Look at those toes. They're lining up perfectly, right? How often do you stand around in the elevator with your toes lined up perfectly, pointing straight forward, right? Never. So just fix it. Like make it seem more alive, right? Some of these are just about angles to the camera. So when the hand lines up at a perpendicular angle, or at least a parallel angle to the camera, then your finger looks like, or your hand looks like it's 1 finger thick. Like how many fingers does this character have? If you just add a little rotation to it, that's a better silhouette. A couple of other things that happen in this silhouette is, they're called coincidental line or tangents. It's points at which things in the foreground, middle ground, and background seem to be touching each other even though they're not. So stuff like the tips of the fingers, the side of the hand, like all these little things that are showing up in there as, wow, it looks like his finger's just poking the top of that box, or his head is completely constrained. If you overlap those things a little bit more, then it gives the scene more depth and your silhouette's better. So, again, making Franklin's pose less boring. We can increase the silhouette a little bit here, fix some of those little pet peeves of mine, and now it's a little bit of a better pose. Like, what is he doing? I don't know. Maybe he's walking along a beach, like pointing at something on the horizon, or telling somebody at Home Depot which shovel he wants. All right. So here's where the presentation starts going a little faster. Let's look at some examples of these three things: contrapposto, line of action, and silhouette. Don't just take my word for it. Ask the experts. So classical art, we're going to see contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. Does it work if you're on a boat? Yes, it does. Contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. What about for sculptures? It's not the best angle on this, but we can see contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. What if you're naked playing music? Yes, contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. What if you're hugging a duck? Contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. Of course, our old buddy David, contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. In fact, Michelangelo was super good at this. Like, Michelangelo is a master for a reason. If we look at like the Sistine Chapel ceiling, we're seeing contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. Like everything that if you look at that entire ceiling, every one of them have amazing silhouettes. So much so that you can recognize this piece just from those silhouettes, right? You all know what this is, to the point that you recognize it even from parodies of it. And the reason we recognize that, the reason this one is so important is because it's so good. I mean, like, this struck me while I was putting this together. Look at God's toe. Like, it is so clearly defined. Like, I have never drawn anything as pretty as God's toe is in this painting, right? And that's because he didn't just phone that in. He put thought into the way that shape is defined on that background, on that negative space. Right? And if you look at this contrapposto line of action, the line of actions seem to be sort of pushing each other a little bit. This nice line of action connecting them together, and this silhouette. And I love the silhouette that there's a tiny gap in between their two fingers, right? This isn't the moment of touch. This is either the moment after or the moment before, right? I think contextually probably the moment after. In fact, if you look at every one of those little cherubim, or I don't actually know the names of types of angels, in the background there, they all have strong contrappostos, line of actions, and silhouettes. Classic traditional animation. Again, I think this is John Lounsbury, his Sheriff of Nottingham animation. You'll see contrapposto, line of action, and silhouette. Game characters, Ratchet and Clank here, contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. Again, comic books. I love this scene. This is one of the ones I snapshotted. This is where Laura X-23 meets Logan for the first time, and like you can it's. I just love this pose. Like there's just so much going on in it. But we got this contrapposto. We got this twisting happening in his spine. We got these two lines of action where it feels like they're pushing at each other. Like you can feel the tension between those two lines. You see this line of action for his arms and where his other claw is pointed. We see this line of action where she's pushing his arm away and how her other arm is coming in. We see these lines of action here, just keeping that looking interesting. And just based on the silhouette alone, we can like read a lot about this pose, right? We can tell a lot about the forces and the tension in this. Brad Bird is actually incredible at this. All of his shots can be analyzed in a similar way, but I love this contrapposto. Now recognize that Bob doesn't really have much of a contrapposto, and the reason for that is because they were trying to suck out all of the personality from him in this. They wanted him to seem like joyless, right? Well, the boss has got this contrapposto, and then these two lines of action, so even though he is like bullying Bob's towering over him, and you can tell that in the line of action that he's having to look up. And you get this arm that creates this line of action that's almost poking Bob in the face, right? Like there's like this scene is very like it's infuriating to watch, and it's all made like amplified by this shape or size comparison that is very clear in their silhouettes, right? Ariel, like I love like this character because like you get this contrapposto, but the line of action is like huge, right? Because she has this big sweeping tail, and her silhouette is extremely obvious because of the shape of her hair. Like you could probably spot Ariel by the shape of her hair alone. Mike and Sully, you got this contrapposto and line of action. I like that Mike's line of action just travels up Bob's head, or I'm sorry, Mike's line of action travels up Sully's arm. And then their silhouettes are very distinctive because one's smooth and round and the other one's big and bulky and furry. Again, Brad Bird, contrapposto, line of action, contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. Right? Occasionally we have characters that we get to add some additional elements to, such as got three contrappostos here, right? We can kind of add this extra angle to his head, which you can do that with a human character too. It helps to give some personality. And then we get this sweeping line of action, and then this silhouette that's very, very clear. Even if we're sort of focused in on the face, we still have all these elements, right? Contrapposto, line of action, these lines of action, and this silhouette. Now, this next scene is to me like one of the modern like Sistine Chapels in terms of poses. So not only is this a great composition, I don't know if y'all have sort of studied the Fibonacci's golden ratio and like how that goes in for composition. So we get these really nice compositions based off of that golden ratio. It's kind of like an alternative to the rule of thirds. But we also get these contrappostos, and then these two lines of action, and you can kind of notice that they're making a parentheses around what? Box. And what's in the box? Nothing is in the box. It's all on Bonnie's side of the parentheses. So, like, it's got this, like, that's Bonnie's now, right? Like, it's not in the box anymore, and it's not on Andy's side. There's even some empty spot shown on Andy's side to make that very clear. And then there's these silhouettes that are very, like, pretty, but what I love in this silhouette is, look what's poking out of Bonnie's silhouette. Can you recognize what that is? It's Woody, right? Look what Woody's pointed at. Yeah. Pointing at Andy, right? So we get this arm of Andy's, this contrapposto of his shoulders, pointing down his arm, and he's pointing at Woody. And then that runs right back up Bonnie into her eyes, who's looking at him. And you just get this really nice sweeping line of action through the whole thing. So yeah, it's just I love this scene. Like, I love this shot. So those are my 3 pet peeves that stemmed mostly from straight ahead and post to pose and staging. But I kind of lied. There's still another one that we're going to talk about today, which is exaggeration. And of course, when I made this, I'm like, I wonder how big I could actually make it before it gets too big. Which I think is actually part of the point of exaggeration. When we talk about exaggeration, we're talking about pushing it, like making it more clear. So again, exaggeration is not making it bigger, it's making it read more clearly. And so the phrase that you hear me say is push it until you break it. Right? So if we take an emotion like fear, and we sort of develop a pose around that idea of fear. This is like where you had to do that with Ben Bot and Animation Fundamentals, right? So this isn't bad. It kind of reads as like that dread, but it's not necessarily a fear for his life, right? Like this is fear for, did I remember to mail off my taxes, right? So this isn't broken, even if it is communicating. So I'm going to go ahead and push it then. I'm going to make it a little bit more exaggerated, right? So if I push it a little bit further, this is starting to read a little bit more like fear. It's like, crap, I didn't mail off my taxes, right? Versus if we push it a little bit more, like it's not broken yet, right? So a lot of times you would just give up here and be like, I'm done, that's my fear pose. But try to make it better. If you try to make it better and push it more, like that's more like the IRS is knocking on my door, right? Like this is much more concerned. So it's not broken though. Like this is where at first I was like, that's it. I pushed it far enough. But I had to follow my own rules. Like, did I push it a little bit more and see if it breaks it or not? So I pushed it a little bit more, and so, like, you could say this is broken unless it was for something like Hotel Transylvania. Like, if you look at some of the breakdown poses in Hotel Transylvania, it's ridiculously exaggerated. So it's not necessarily broken in that case. So we can push it again. So we push it one more time. No, we broke it. So go back one, Control Z, right? That's what we have, or that's what I have on this pose lecture. Again, how many of you had seen that before, after all? Almost everybody? Okay, there's a handful of people who didn't. Hopefully this time through, though, you saw it with hindsight of animations you'd done in the past, right? I also think it's important to remember those things. So, of course, I have my questions and comments card there because I forgot to take it out. So hopefully that gives you some hindsight to look back at animations you did in the past and say, oh, I see where I could have pushed that now, or I see at least what you weren't thinking about at that time. So, I'm going to go over just a couple of more things really quick, and then we're going to take a break and come back. So, let me get to it. Marlo. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and stop that recording too.